This year's World Refugee Day is being marked under the theme Hope Away from Home. A recent United Nations report has found that by the end of last year, over 100 million people had been displaced due to war, rights abuses and persecution. Let's talk about this now with human rights activist and Maverick Citizen editor Mark Heywood. Mark, a very good evening to you. Welcome back to Newzroom Afrika. Just how dire is the situation for the many displaced people in the world when you consider the thousands, as we speak tonight, fleeing Sudan?
Good evening. Well, the situation is terrible, frankly. You know, as you mentioned in your introduction, we probably now have the largest numbers of refugees in recorded history, an estimated 110 million refugees worldwide. And that number is growing, as you've mentioned, literally every day because of wars such as that in Sudan, continued displacement of people out of countries like Syria and Afghanistan, parts of our continent. But another major growing factor that is causing people to leave their homes and leave their countries is the climate crisis. So we have a whole new category of refugees, estimated, I think, at about 20 million a year, that is now due to global heating, which is making people's lives impossible in certain parts of the world. So it really is a terrible humanitarian disaster on a scale that's hard to describe.
And if 110 million people are refugees globally, where do most of those people even go when you consider the growing hostility and conservative rules being made around migration control by many countries in the world, more so around Europe at the moment?
Well, that's a very good question. And, you know, you would think, given the sort of xenophobic reactionary statements that came from people like former President Trump in the United States, that come out of European leaders like Boris Johnson and so on, that most of the refugees are going to developed countries. But what this report from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees shows is that most of the refugees are coming from low and middle income countries, and they are going, in most cases, to other low and middle income countries, placing further strain on the already stretched resources of those countries. You know, we see it in Southern Africa because of crisis, the political crisis. It's not wars, although it's deep corruption in countries like Zimbabwe, in Swaziland, and so on, is leading to people coming to South Africa. And that is going on in different parts of the world. But, you know, again, this report is showing, and for good reason, I guess, the focus is on people trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, the Aegean Sea, people trying to get from South America into North America, and the terrible cost in lives. I mean, we just saw last week, you know, probably 500 people, many of them women and children, drowning on a boat trying to get from North Africa to Greece or to Italy. So it's a very sad situation.
And you've written, for example, just for our viewers who've not seen your piece, about how the Mediterranean, for instance, is something you've described as a mass grave, because in 2022 alone, some 3,789 refugees died trying to cross the sea or the Sahara. And that is just in one area. People are making other dangerous crossings as well, because conditions back home are simply such that they cannot afford to stay there.
Yeah, I mean, the English Channel, 47,000 people, I think, trying to cross in little rowing boats, basically dinghies, across the busiest shipping lane in the world, from France and parts of Europe into England. People trying to cross the Sahara. You just have to imagine that. People fleeing from countries like Syria. No, it's just the pain and the trauma and the suffering is really unimaginable. But it presents us, I think, and this is what I'm trying to argue in this article, with a new global crisis that I don't think people and governments have properly contemplated yet, and which we certainly are not prepared for. And in a country like South Africa, we need to prepare for this refugee crisis. We need to adopt policies which are based on human rights, which are based on compassion and inclusion, but are within our resources.
How then do governments including South Africa, strike that balance, right? Because you are calling for a compassionate response, show some level of care for people who are displaced by conditions back home. Yet, domestically, many of these governments are under pressure to deliver and meet the needs of their own citizens who are growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of delivery, and therefore much of that ends up being directed at people who are either migrants or refugees. How do you strike the balance?
Well, that's a very good question. And the answer is that, you can't separate this refugee crisis and the demands it places on all societies from what is going on at home in inverted commas. In a country like South Africa, we are losing billions and billions of rands to corruption, to mismanagement, to cronyism, and so on. So the resource problem, the problem of our health services, the unemployment problem, the education problem is not to do with refugees. It is to do with mismanagement that is taking place at home. So we need to fix that mismanagement. We need to do what our constitution requires of us in terms of ensuring equality in this country, social justice for all people. And we need to be having a discussion within the Southern African Development Community, of which we are a member, about how the community as a whole manages the costs of migration so that single countries are not called upon unduly to bear it. But Temekile, there's one last thing I'd say, is that we also need to be adopting policies that help to prevent the refugee crisis in the first place. So, Zimbabwe has an election coming up on August the 23rd of this year. If South Africa once again turns a blind eye to the stealing of another election in Zimbabwe, and we tolerate the continued misrule and corruption that exists in that country, then we will continue to have the crisis that we have of our borders in relation to Zimbabwe and South Africa. So there's in fact many, many ways that we can tackle this crisis if we do so in a thoughtful, rational, and I would say humane way.
And is it humane, I wonder, that some European countries are now looking at African countries that are transit points, for instance, to take money in the form of assistance to improve infrastructure and provide other care for refugees and migrants in order to stop them traveling all the way to Europe?
Well, Europe must get its own house in order, frankly. They have their own problems of misgovernance. We must get our house in order. And as I say, we must get our policies sorted out. But using aid, trying to bribe developing countries to adopt policies that protect so-called developed countries is certainly not going to work. We have to deal with the system issues that underlie this crisis. We have to both deal with the problem in a caring way, but we also have to look at what are the measures that need to be taken that can limit the problem. So again, talking about the intersection of issues, if we don't deal with the climate crisis properly in South Africa, if we don't deal with carbon emissions, if we don't comply with our international obligations, we make worse the climate crisis. We are causing climate refugees in other countries, in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, who then, in a circular motion, come back to South Africa. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that all of these things are linked, and they require a holistic, thought-out response if we're to deal with them properly.
Right. Mark Heywood, thank you so much for your time.